America is a nation founded on principles instead of ethnicity or culture, freedom, rights, the pursuit of happiness. In this episode of The March to Monarchism, we explore how America was doomed to fail from the beginning and how everything about America is a lie. England, land of the English. Scotland, land of the Scots. Russia, land of the Rus. Turkey, land of the Turks. What is America? It's not the land of Amerigo Vespucci, because that wouldn't even make sense. England, Scotland, Russia, Turkey. These are cultural tribes with homogeneous gene pools, or at least some used to be. America was never any such thing. So what is America? It's an idea. Lie number 1, freedom. The freedom propaganda is just a plain lie. For a nation to even function, it needs a degree of freedom. Too little freedom or too much freedom, and the nation state will collapse. That sweet middle ground is called order, sandwiched right between tyranny and anarchy. So, that being said, what does freedom even mean? Is it the freedom to choose one's occupation? Okay, most civilizations have already had that. Historically, not really for women, but that's a good thing. Is it the freedom to marry whoever you want? Okay, historically, most peasants were already able to do that. Is it the freedom to say whatever you want? Okay, here are some examples where it's never been okay to say whatever you want. Under oath in a courtroom, called perjury. Making threats, making libel claims, anything that would violate a signed contract, such as an NDA. False advertising, and the list goes on. Should freedom mean that you can lie under oath? How free did you feel when COVID-19 began? Someone who wasn't elected restricted all of your freedoms against your will. Did democracy or the Constitution protect your freedom of speech, of movement, or your freedom to make a living? Whether it's the government directly or not, the government still has its proxies, big tech primarily, but it has the bureaucracy, unelected people who control your life far more than the founders ever wanted or predicted. I am genuinely wondering what my fellow Americans mean when they glorify freedom. America is not an anarchist state, so please, someone make the word freedom in the American context make sense. We always have and we always will have laws in this country, because that is required for order. Even far more laws when you're a democracy. Except it's even worse in a federal state, such as America, because federal, by definition, means everybody has to live under two entire legal systems. You have to live under the laws of the country as a whole, the federal government, and the specific laws of your home state. Two entire systems of laws. How's that for freedom? When you study prohibition, you find that it was a complete shit show. It turned America into a nation of criminals. We tried to ban alcohol. Just think about that for 5 minutes. The Nation of Liberty tried to ban alcohol. That's like trying to ban certain sex positions. There are some things in this world you just can't realistically stop people from doing, especially if you pride yourselves on being the land of the free. Remember when marijuana was illegal? And at the federal level it technically still is. Yeah, well, how well did that turn out? Americans live under so many laws, we all probably break several of them on a daily basis without even realizing it. You know the quote by Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's right-hand man, "Show me the man and I'll find you the crime"? This bullshit also makes me think of what Donald Trump's political opponents, also known as the current presidential administration, because everything they have convicted Trump of is random bullshit that even most of his ardent haters don't even know the details of. Laws Trump most likely broke by accident, if he even really did break them in the first place, and didn't hurt anyone anyway, even if he did. But enough about political witch hunts. Point is, Americans live under so many laws they can't possibly memorize them all, especially since laws get added and altered every single year. Lie number 2, democracy. Democracy, my most loathed enemy. First and foremost, the Founding Fathers hated democracy. Here are a few quotes from the Founding Fathers concerning democracy. I've heard a lot of people, including right-wingers, say that America is not a democracy, but rather a constitutional republic. I've talked about this multiple times on this channel. Democracy basically just means the common people voting. Regardless of how that vote is applied, do Americans vote? Yes. Then it's a democracy. I've said multiple times that you can't have democracy without republicanism, nor republicanism without democracy. And as a side, calling a political system a constitutional something is redundant. A constitution isn't a system, and every nation I can think of has a constitution, including North Korea. America is a federal republic. People vote. Therefore, America is a democracy. So now I'm going to criticize America for being a democracy. You know, it's fascinating that a group of men who have nothing positive to say about democracy could actually convince themselves, oh, but if we do it differently, it'll work. Wasn't Rome a republic before it imploded? And Greece? Mind you, the Roman Republic preceded the Founding Fathers by 2,100 years. It's not like the Roman Republic had just happened, so they had no excuse for thinking republicanism was a good idea. A republic, if you can keep it. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So the Founding Fathers didn't even fully agree with the system they just created, but thought it was cool because Americans were wonderful and always would be. No, seriously, this only makes sense if you think Americans will always, no matter what happens, be a righteous, moral, and religious people. They didn't understand something that should have been easy to understand. Unless there are things in place to keep the people moral and religious, human nature will ruin everything. So they thought electing politicians would keep Americans moral and religious? Make it make sense. In my opinion, the Founding Fathers were morons. They hated democracy, but they hated monarchy even more. Despite being highly educated men, they still didn't understand human nature, and thus were still utopians. Oh yes, utopianism, trying to create a perfect world. And they actually thought some pieces of paper could create and maintain this perfect world? There will never be a perfect world. If you're going to build a government, build it on the idea of stability, nothing else. And only one system in the world has ever proven to be stable long term. Democracy is a variant of communism. Left-wing means egalitarian activism, while right-wing means acknowledgement of differences. Left-wing, eliminating differences. Right-wing, acknowledging differences. The idea behind democracy is that everyone chooses who rules over them. One person, one vote. In the eyes of electing government officials, everyone is equal, because everyone is just one vote. Even if you trail off into weirdness, making some people count as multiple votes, human nature dictates that down the road, democracy will still become increasingly equal, or at least it'll try. It's how you win votes. You make promises and sometimes you keep them. And of course, promises always include who gets to vote now. In America, first only landowners could vote. Then by and by, women got to vote. Then anybody above a certain age got to vote. And it will degrade even more. Just give it time. Democracy always degrades over time. That's the nature of trying to win votes. Why do you think Biden allowed an invasion at the southern border? Illegal immigrants are far more likely to vote for Democrats, the party that gives away free shit. So no matter how your democracy starts out, it still becomes egalitarian and then tyrannical. And what was the point of all this democracy in the first place? To stop one person from wielding too much power for too long? Here's where the Founding Fathers and 99% of Americans maintain their status as complete morons when it comes to politics. Tyranny can come from the many, not just the one. In fact, it's inherent to democracy to be tyrannical. It is the rule of the majority. It is mob rule. And you know what? The inverse is also true. Freedom can come from the one. In fact, I'd argue that freedom can only come from the one. Freedom is not guaranteed from the one, but I guarantee it can only come from the one. It can never come from the many. Americans, just because you're used to something doesn't mean you're free. We are not free. The Constitution says we have freedom of speech, but when exactly are you able to exercise that freedom? Basically just in your own house. Say the wrong thing at work, and you get potentially fired for creating a hostile work environment. Say the wrong thing in public, you could be arrested for disturbing the peace. Say the wrong thing online, and they censor you, just like my channel will be censored one day, if it hasn't been already. And yes, the government is happy to go along with it anytime you say something that they don't approve of and someone else censors you for it. They may not censor you directly, but they will allow their proxies to do it for them. It's just less freedom with more steps. Less freedom with more steps. That's all it is. Democracy is mob rule, It doesn't matter how many buffers you put between the popular vote and the elected. Democracy is still democracy, and buffers don't make it any less mob rule. People vote because they want their vote to matter, but if you put enough buffers in place that ultimately make their vote not matter, you're just going to piss off the voters and divide the country even more. There was no way this was going to end well. Lie number 3, the Constitution. The Constitution, the most hilariously ridiculous thing about America. A piece of paper that somehow has power of its own. Every time you hear an American talk about the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, remind them that those are amendments. They weren't part of the original final draft. The Founding Fathers didn't even think to include free speech or the right to bear arms in this utopian document. And for being such a sacred document, you know what amendments were also once part of the Constitution? Slavery and prohibition. Was the Constitution any less holy when it permitted slavery and outlawed liquor? I already covered how worshiping the idea of free speech is nonsense. But why do Americans need a piece of paper to tell them they can carry a firearm in case the government becomes tyrannical? Would that suddenly stop being true if Congress repealed the Second Amendment? Term limits for our politicians weren't in the Constitution until there was, of course, a fucking amendment. Yes, for all the love Americans have for freedom and keeping the powerful in check, even the Founding Fathers didn't originally think of, maybe we should put term limits on the dickheads in power. It seriously didn't cross their mind at first. You'd think that would have been one of the first things to cross their minds. Last, but certainly not least, where did the Constitution even come from? Talk to any average American and they'll tell you that the Founding Fathers all gathered in a room one night, signed a sacred document, and then showed it to a crowd gathered outside, and all Americans worship this document forevermore. Actually, the U.S. Constitution was composed illegally, and it wasn't even the first document of its kind.
But what, of course, we forget is that our glorious Constitution, as established in 1789, is established in a reactionary coup.
The men who gather in Philadelphia were also willing to ignore their instructions to revise and amend the Articles of Confederation, and instead they decided to come up with an entirely new frame of government, one that they devised in secret sessions with locked doors and windows, despite the summer heat. One can argue that in some ways what you had here was a coup.
Not only is the Constitution a reactionary coup basically orchestrated by George Washington and his friends, a very monarchical individual, one of the things you'll notice is basically the first, you probably can name, the first American Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That the period of basically the Congress of the Confederation totally airbrushed out of history. Do you know who America's first president was? It was John Hanson, the president of the Congress. And the results of that system were so disastrous, and the results of that system were identified by people like John Adams, literally with democracy. And, basically, there was this period of, they were just like, this is a shit show. We have to establish basically responsible aristocratic government. We have to replace democracy with oligarchy. And so we're going to run this constitutional convention.
Lie number 4, the melting pot. The idea of the melting pot comes from what I call Americanism, which is a religion. Yes, America is more of a religion than it is a nation. Because what's left of America if you take away the ideology behind it? At best, America is an idea, and at worst, it's a false religion. But it's certainly not a land, it's not a single people, it's not a heritage, it's not an ethnicity. America has always had demographic clashes. It has never fully lived up to its ideal of blending peoples of every nation into a single identity. There will never be a single identity. That's why America should have been an empire, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. When you think of lynching, you're probably thinking of it happening to blacks, but in actuality it happened to just about every group. In fact, the largest single mass lynching in American history was done to Italian immigrants in 1891. A mass lynching happened to Chinese immigrants in 1871. During the California Gold Rush, at least 160 Mexicans and Chileans were lynched. Just a few things to remember the next time anyone tries to brainwash you into thinking blacks were the only group ever hated in America. But of course, there was slavery, and then Jim Crow preceding it. No matter what you consider your tribe, Whether it's your culture, race, social class, religion, or just your family, humans always have and always will be tribal creatures. When I was a kid, I don't remember people really caring all that much about race. People didn't talk about it all the damn time when I was a kid like they do today. The 90s were probably the closest humanity will ever get to utopia. The fall of the Soviet Union helped a lot in that regard. But despite this relative peace, races still didn't mix much in the 90s. Seeing other mixed kids like myself was very rare, and yet people seemed happy where they were. But it all went to hell when Obama became president. Yes, electing the first black president made race relations worse. And going on 15 years now, people won't shut up about race. And that's just race. When it comes to culture, Mexicans still have their own culture even when they've lived in America for 5 generations. Black culture hasn't blended in with the American ideal of self-sufficiency and hard work. America has always been more of a salad than a melting pot. And for this reason, America would have made a lot more sense as an empire. By empire, I don't mean the whiny leftist definition of empire. I mean an actual empire with an absolute emperor and everything. We let the Native Americans run their own show on reservations, answering to the federal government rather than individual states. So why not do that with everybody? Except the empire would appoint their own governors and enforcers while the people they govern don't hold any kind of office at all. Let the blacks have their own American territory just as long as none of them rule that territory. Same with the Native Americans, same with the Hispanics, same with the Chinese, the Japanese, etc. I'm serious. Either that or just make everyone breed with whites or they're not allowed to breed at all. One of the two. The point is, humans aren't wired to live alongside those who are different. We've tried and failed for over 2 centuries. It got better briefly, but now it's going in reverse. Last thing I'll say about America's melting pot ideal. It's poisonous to the rest of the world. Just 3 centuries ago, before America existed as an independent nation, would England have ever dreamed of allowing non-English people to flood into their country? No. England was no different from any other nation, including African nations, where if you aren't part of the native population, you have fewer rights, period. Most of the history of war is not against people that look all that different, but still tribal. It's not just race I'm talking about here. It's about being too different in any sort of way. Foreigners in any nation should be treated as guests at best and enemies at worst. But before America, it was unthinkable to treat outsiders as kin. Even in Africa, they are prejudiced against other blacks from different tribes. I watched a movie about that subject once when I was younger. The rest of the Western world adopting Americanism, thinking every nation should be a melting pot, is a large portion of what's destroying the West. That's how you destroy a people from within. Invite in people who don't belong and treat them like they belong. You can open your house to strangers, but that doesn't mean they care anything about your house. Some genuinely want to burn your house to the ground. Most of the rest will do it incidentally. You will never deprogram humans from being tribal. Most people want a perfect world where we all sing together like a Disney song. But that's not reality. To understand human tribalism, stand up right now, walk to your front door, and just stare at the lock for half an hour, thinking about nothing but why that lock is there and why you use it. Then tribalism will start to make sense. So, if America is one big lie and is using a stupid system, how has it remained standing even this long, and how did it become a superpower? First reason is capitalism. Of course, to say that America is capitalist would be an understatement. And I love capitalism, don't get me wrong. It is the only system that lifts people out of poverty and leads to the best innovations. For a nation founded on hyper-individuality and being the land of opportunity, the only one in the history of the world, mind you, of course it's going to rise when all its people are busy either raising families, women, or competing with each other near to death, men. Of course that's a recipe for success, but not stability. We are a nation of consumption. Whatever it takes to make a buck, which means controlling everything we can, owning everything we can, and always looking for new ways to do both. Gorging ourselves until we're the fattest kid on the block is actually not anything to brag about, because as I just said, it's a recipe for success, but not for stability. The second reason, the rest of the Western world nerfed themselves after the American and French revolutions. Even after this, it wasn't difficult to remain ahead of Africa and the Middle East for obvious reasons. Third reason, the character of the American people. No matter your culture's habits, traditions, beliefs, or what have you, if your society's people are of upstanding moral character, they will be successful, period. America was founded by people, and remained a people, who believed in freedom, making one's own way, the rule of law, earning what one has. The character of a nation's people is far more important than their written laws. And the final reason, Christianity, the greatest religion the world has ever seen, something you must admit even if you don't follow it. I will make a March to Monarchism video someday regarding Christianity, but for now I will leave it there. Christianity is the GOAT.
Still, as much care as the framers took to constrain government power, federal and state, they knew their efforts would fail unless one more component was present. Citizens imbued with the spirit of republicanism. People who understood the principles of their Constitution, who valued self-government, and who would be willing to do the work necessary for its maintenance. Citizens who would not yield to demagogues who promised prosperity, security, or anything else at the price of liberty. James Madison had this in mind when he said that only a well-instructed people could be permanently a free people. By a well-instructed people, Madison meant above all a people well-educated about our constitutional liberties and responsibilities. When, at the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, a woman asked Benjamin Franklin what kind of government he and the others had proposed for the nation, he famously responded, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." The wise old Philadelphia polymath had history in mind in giving that answer. He knew that he and his colleagues at the convention had supplied only the mechanics of what was needed for a republic to long endure. The rest could only be supplied by we the people, understanding and fulfilling our duties as citizens.
No, the people are lost. This was never going to last forever. Yes, it was character, honor, and the Christian faith that made us a great people, not any legislation. America's success, not to mention its literal location, made it so insulated from the rest of our dangerous world that Americans have taken their freedom, their rights, their safety, and their luxuries all for granted. For generations now, we've been so shielded from reality that half the country doesn't even believe in reality anymore. For as much as I hate modernity and the left, I can't entirely blame either for the way things are now. We are victims of our own success. The entire West is. Comfort is all we've ever known. We can't help but take it for granted. But America was never a land, an ethnicity, or a people. America is an idea, and I myself believe in that idea. Nobody wants to live under tyranny, but the way my country has implemented that idea has been false from the start. By trying to legislate freedom, they created a vast, encroaching bureaucracy that has its claws in every aspect of American life. This was never going to last, because it was a mistake to make America a democratic republic. This was never going to last because it was a mistake to make America multi-ethnic or tolerating other cultures. If you're an American, are you free? Are you happy? Are you well off? One of the purposes of my channel is to explain to people that democracy is the problem, and the downfall of the West we are witnessing is because of democracy. I believe in the idea of America, but only as a set of traditions. The things Americans want, the things Americans believe in, those things can't be written into law. As I always say, study power, not ideology, because those in power are the ones who decide how much freedom you really have, not a piece of paper, not legislation. The things Americans believe in, the things our founding fathers believed in, they only exist in the land if the people of the land believe in them. People can't be forced into believing them. And as strange as it is to say this, we are living in a time when at least half the country wants less freedom. They want more government because they think it'll solve all of their problems and make them happier. Just because you live on this land doesn't mean everyone believes in the things that built this land. Conservatives hate communism because it's a utopian ideal that only brings dystopia. Democracy is also utopian, and it brings dystopia too, only more slowly. The only peace in this world is stability. If you want good for your people, then be good for your people. Humans will never be able to legislate a perfect world, and for God's sake, we need to stop trying.